All right. I forgot to bring my books with me to sell to you all. So if you want one, I put my notebook back there. You can put down your name and either your email if you want me to contact you that way, or your address if you want me to just mail it to you along with a little invoice. And you could also scan. I put my business card back there. You can scan the QR code and it'll take you right to my website where you can buy it from the website. So any of those ways work. I apologize for not being more on top of that. But this work has been supported by the Idaho Humanities Council. It's the foundation for a follow-up book, kind of extending the work that I did initially. I, at first, wanted to include all of this information in the one book, but of course that was way too big of a project and I didn't know what I was signing myself up for. So I am happy to share with you this information. It's about the history of federal intervention in the Silver Valley / Shoshone County. And if you guys have a better idea for a title, I'm open to help. Right now, what I'm working with is busted. So kind of pulling together the idea of sex work and gambling and the feds intervening. So, you know, multiple ways of the term busted coming out there. So I'm also thinking about Wallace as an example of America's last real Western town where we had old-style brothels and gambling up until 1991, which was about a century after everybody else did. So that's kind of one thing that I think makes Wallace unique. Tonight I'm going to talk about some of the values and the cultural aspect of our history and how the history of federal intervention impacted the cultural values and beliefs that we have, and trying to explain how outsiders' attempts to control the people and the resources of Wallace influenced our way of life there. Now, I'm thinking about Wallace's fight for autonomy through this research, and also kind of trying to make connections to mining culture specifically, and freedom, democracy, power, all that stuff that is really important to Americans in general, but also to people in North Idaho in particular. See if I can figure out how to advance us here. All right, sweet. So the labor wars of 1892 and 1899 kind of set the stage for the federal interventions that would follow. The governor of the state of Idaho declared martial law in response to the violent acts of protest, and this took place in kind of like two major episodes. The first one was at the Frisco Mill, and then the second one was at the Bunker Hill concentrator. So that's what I'll cover in part one. Part two is Prohibition era raid in 1929, right after the stock market crashed. Feds came to Wallace and Mullen in order to prosecute city and local officials for violating the National Prohibition Act, or the Volstead Act. And then part three is the FBI raid in 1991, where I think it was 150 agents, I probably should correct that, busted down the doors of every single bar in Shoshone County, about 60 bars, and a couple in Kootenai County too that they weren't supposed to. So to kind of not bury the lead here. This is an overview. Our mining culture and autonomy come from our values and traditions. I'm going to address the question of how our mining culture compares to state and state and national interests. So in my first book, I identified several lines of argument that my theory, I guess, is that these lines of argument, these sayings that kind of got repeated in small talk and gossip, were really what kind of cultivated an attitude of acceptance around keeping the brothels and sex work around for so long. And so I'm also kind of in this work looking again at some new lines of argument that support the ideas of, Wallace really valuing freedom and rebellion. And so one that I found was a miner is sort of an independent person. This idea of independence and not wanting people to tell us how to live kind of comes up over and over again in the research. Outsiders don't have the right to tell us what to do because they haven't earned the right through understanding the context of our way of life. Another line of argument that people are saying that people have a lot is work hard, play hard. And we hear this a lot in the West in general, but especially in a mining town where you're putting your life at risk. And the idea is that when you're working so hard, you really need to be able to blow off some steam. You need to be able to play hard too. Of course, that leads to heavy drinking and gambling, and basically as this kind of extension of that life risking and risky environment of being close to death every day underground. And then finally, a mining town needs brothels is of course a saying that came up over and over again. And this is kind of the theme that I was exploring in my first book. But in short, men greatly outnumbered the women in mining camps, and sex workers were seen as necessary to keep the men mining. They were also seen as necessary to keep the respectable women safe from sexual assault. And then our last line of argument that kind of comes out as a theme is live and let live. And again, we hear this a lot in Western culture in general, but especially the ideas that we have all these diverse immigrants, we have a need to allow people to live in their own accordance with their own culture. So it's not really like a melting pot, it's more like a salad bowl. Everyone's just trying to survive. Everyone's trying to better their circumstances. Okay, so to start diving into the labor wars of 1892 and 1899, the problems arose as a result of tensions between the mine owners and the labor unions. So the interests of the outside investors versus the interests of the miners. So you got over here the mine owners, and you've got over here the mine workers. And so they're they're clashing, right? This is happening all over the West, in Colorado, in Butte. The Butte labor union disputes have very much inspired what starts to take place in Wallace and Shoshone County. But the more basic origin of the battle was actually a change in technology. So Kathy Aiken, historian at University of Idaho, she writes in her Bunker Hill book that anytime there's a change in technology, that creates stress for both workers and management, right? Mechanical mucking and drilling meant fewer people could do the work. It led to displaced miners who were paid lower wages because the traditional relationship between wages earned and work done no longer made sense. And so this is something that happens anytime we've got a change in technology, right? People become displaced, and then it throws into chaos the established pattern of what kind of work and how that work gets compensated. And then, but the catalyst, so even though that was the origin for the 1892 battle, the catalyst for what happened was this Pinkerton agent, Siringo, his identity as a mine owner spy came forward. So he'd been a really effective spy for the mine owners. He got way up there in the actual labor organization. He, I think, even became like a secretary. So he ended up getting his identity became revealed, and this kind of touched off all this brewing tension that had been kind of stirring underground. Disputes with the railroads exacerbated the problem, and so did a nationwide economic panic. So throughout this time, there was a recession that happened as well. And all these things kind of came together to lead to 1,500 state and federal troops that got brought into town under martial law by the governor. And here you can see the soldier encampment. This was on Hotel Street in Wallace. They, basically had a very big presence. They rounded up 600 men, all the miners they possibly could, basically, and they put them into these concentration camp environments, both in Wallace and in Wardner. And this was a huge deal. We didn't really have any precedent established for these like concentration camp-like environments where there was cold exposure. They hadn't had due process of law. There was no evidence. They were simply rounded up if they looked like a miner. And they were incarcerated for 4 months without habeas corpus. I mean, this is a basic human right that was established in the Magna Carta, right? And that we agreed as a country that we want to abide by. But they just kind of threw it out the window with the martial law. Only 17 of these 600 miners that they round up were actually convicted. So then, of course, they say that, the last war plants the seeds for the next war, and that was the case here with the labor battles as well. The 1892 battle led directly to the violence at Bunker Hill, which happened in 1899. By then, the Western Federation of Miners, the labor union, was very strong, and they had reestablished themselves in the valley. Bunker Hill was the lone holdout. They were not willing to allow any union miners to work there. This time, I argue, it was not as much about money as it was about control. Steunenberg, who was the governor at that time, declared martial law, and he was eventually assassinated by Harry Orchard on behalf of the Western Federation of Miners. That's a whole nother story, which if you're interested, there's a couple books about it. Rocky Mountain Revolution is one of them. There's a few others that are pretty interesting story to read. So what happened was these miners became upset at a union meeting. Probably they were drinking. And they decided to hijack a train. The train was engineered by Hercules worker / owner Levi Hutton, May Arkwright Hutton's husband. 800 miners held him at gunpoint, and he called himself a willing participant, actually, but he was essentially held at gunpoint. And they made him drive the train from Burke all the way down through the valley. They loaded it up with dynamite at the Frisco. They picked up guys from Mullen when they arrived at Wallace, and then they just loaded up the train along the way. It's called the Dynamite Express. And then by the time they arrived in Kellogg, they had at least 1,000 miners. They made sure everyone was out of the concentrator and the mill at Bunker Hill before they blew them up. It had been just built, 1 year earlier. This concentrator and mill had been built, so it was really fancy, and it was worth about $250,000 at that time, which in 21st century currency, $8 million would have been. It was very fancy and upsetting to the mine owners, of course. There were 3 giant explosions. The debris flew all the way into downtown Kellogg, a mile away. And then here I put a quote from Kathy Aiken's Bunker Hill book. Among the frenzied mob, scores of women, the wives and friends of dynamiters, shrieked out their delight and clapped their hands in fiendish glee at a criminal act which they had been told would clear the country of all opposition to the unions. Well, how do you think that worked out? Do you suppose there was backlash? So once again, this time it was black troops who were brought in from Fort Sherman because most of the other soldiers of it were fighting the Spanish-American War. They rounded up 700 miners, or anyone who didn't have a time card from Bunker Hill proving they were underground during the explosion, and they put them into the concentration camp like bullpens once again. So these innocent men were held illegally, and this guy in the, let's see if I can, this guy, there's an oral history in one of Burt Russell's and Marie Russell's books, I think it's called Rockburst, and they talk about how he couldn't even speak English. He was just this immigrant guy who was like wandering around on the streets, and they just rolled him on up, you know. And basically all these guys got blacklisted. They weren't allowed ever to work in another mine again. And some of their descendants even, like I think Judge Magnuson talked to me about this and how difficult it was. These people had come out here to make their living, and then all of a sudden they had that taken away from them, even if they hadn't done anything. 3 men died of disease in the bullpens, and 1 became suicidal and drowned himself. It's really bad conditions. And then in the aftermath, Steunenberg also impeached all the government officials in Shoshone County except the coroner. So these are people who had been elected to represent, you know, our citizenry, but the state of Idaho seemed to be overriding this democratic process, right? They were installing this oligarchical style of government in Shoshone County to represent the interests of the mine owners rather than the citizens. By the way, the coroner was kept because he'd been the doctor for Bunker Hill, so he was a good, you know, company guy. So here, this was a really big deal because the governor interfered with both a due process of law with the bullpens and the martial law, and acting against, you know, these basic human rights, as well as appearing to basically install a government for the mine company. These labor wars then set the stage for Shoshone County's subsequent cultural attitude in favor of following rules instead of written laws. And as you might imagine, basically not trusting the government at all, because we've got this precedent established. And then we've also got this yellow dog contract saying that basically you're not going to be working in the mines anymore. All right. So moving forward to the North Idaho Whiskey Rebellion, it was also called the Rum Rebellion or the Threefold Conspiracy. So the Silver Valley was like this moonshiner's paradise, right? It had these abandoned mines, it had rugged mountains, and it had the authorities' blatant disregard for written law, right? Like, here's a place where you can do whatever you want, because basically you have to follow the rules, right? You have to follow what the local elected officials tell you to do, but you don't have to obey these written laws that the rest of the country is beholden to. The resulting raid, which happened just after the stock market crash, it basically involved most every government official in both Wallace and Mullen. They had a lot of people from Kellogg also involved, and they were all accused of graft and corruption. So I want to pause for a second to kind of point out this fun little oral history story that I found about Sam Preston, who was he was basically the biggest bootlegger. He distilled most of the county's liquor out of the abandoned Success mine. And lots of these mines were apparently very good for allowing the alcohol to age, because they were filled with water, and there's something about the water and the pull of the moon, and it supposedly like makes it ages the liquor very well. So there's this oral history story of this Sam Preston. So he was one who was rounded up in the 1929 raid, and there's a story about the jury wanting to see the evidence of his guilt during the trial. So according to this story, the jury asked for 2 gallons of the whiskey that he'd brewed, and they take it in the jury room, and they don't come out, and they don't come out, and they don't come out. Finally, they come out, and they're all just shit-faced. This is the quote. And the judge says, "Have you reached a verdict yet?" And the foreman stands up and he says, "Your Honor, in these days when men are going blind, even dying from drinking bad whiskey, we find it impossible to convict this gentleman of any wrongdoing." Wallace Mayor Herman Rossi himself unapologetically told the Seattle Star he would take the case all the way to the Supreme Court. Wallace residents knew that the miners demanded a certain amount of license, and they knew that certain conditions would exist. He's talking about prostitution and gambling, and in addition to the drinking. And even if they did close their eyes, so they left their eyes open, was his rationale. During the trial, it was revealed that Mayor Rossi owned a quarter share of the Armet Rooms, as did Wallace City Treasurer Charles Keating. And as I put some quotes from the newspaper up here. So the Spokesman Review called Wallace a modern Sodom, basically kind of like reveling. The Spokesman Review often came out with these articles that were like very like, like in the Facebook days, you see people getting after others, like shaming them basically. And like Spokesman Review did this from time to time to Wallace. Like they were like, "Shame on you, Wallace." And so they called Wallace a modern Sodom. And the Wallace Press-Times says, "Those are fighting words." And they published a resolution from 100 businessmen who boycotted the businesses and the papers. And then it also kind of harkened back to back in 1899 when again the Spokane Spokesman Review was kind of doing the same thing, and the Mullen Mirror said that the money from the Silver Valley made Spokane what it is, and yet the people and pros of that hobo town are ungrateful enough to smite the hand that feeds them. This is an ongoing theme. The judge also participated in the shaming during the trial. He told city officials that they, should not be collecting these bloody spoils from the pitiable women whose fate had brought them there. He basically compared the cities to being pimps, saying there is nothing in the scale of society that is more loathsome or despicable than a man who accepts in whole or in part to live off of the earnings of a fallen woman. And he's saying, how does that become any better when it's practiced as a means of supporting a municipality of a city, right? Madam Dolly Summers, pictured here, she countered that she paid willingly for police protection because she appreciated that they would jump in to prevent roughhousing in her place. The city clerk testified there was no graft, there was no secrecy. These collections were a matter of public record. There were no bribes or payoffs that were going into private pockets. Rather, it was a pragmatic, unofficial fee system that allowed Shoshone County officials to enforce local preferences regarding the law. The system reflects the community's priorities, values, and motivations for electing said civic leaders, right? So this was something, they were executing the will of the people, right? They were not, eventually, they were found, they were found not guilty. They did get convicted initially, but then the Ninth Circuit Court reversed all the convictions. Their logic there was that not enforcing federal laws did not constitute a conspiracy to break the law, and nor did it make government officials guilty of corruption. So where they fell legally was like basically like if the sheriff and the local officials don't want to enforce the laws, then we're not gonna like say that they were conspiring to break them. They just weren't enforcing them. Let's see. Yeah, so the judge found that the federal government lacked the authority to compel local officials to enforce the law. The Ninth Circuit Court also basically said that the system that Shoshone County had in place was helpful to allow them to maintain control and respect of the citizenry, even though they were blatantly ignoring the law. They said the convictions couldn't be sustained because there was not, quote, a particle of evidence in the record tending even remotely to establish or prove any conspiracy. So this kind of sets the stage then, of course, for the 1991 raid, because the lawyers make a very similar argument. This is another precedent that's established for how things are going to be. So on, does anyone know what date the raid was? That's right, June 23rd. So on June 23rd, 1991, 150 agents with SWAT teams raided around 60 bars and 2 personal homes. They seized $543,576 worth of gambling machines, including computerized video poker, vintage slot machines, blackjack tables, craps tables, numbers wheels, poker tables, punch boards. Basically, if it could be bet on, it was. The FBI bought a tavern and a brothel in Wallace, where they set up videotape and wiretaps during their 2.5-year undercover operation. So this was according to Sam Eisman, the lawyer for Sinkovich. And then he had to go through all this videotape and wiretaps recordings that they'd collected. And they also seized a lot of money just out of the cash registers of the bars. Like they took everything basically that they thought that they deserved. So this was an article that appeared in the New York Times. Timothy Egan wrote this article, and he called the 1991 raid, the action, the biggest federal law enforcement raid ever in the Rocky Mountain region. And he quoted a spokesperson for the FBI to say that. And then he also said, not since the late 19th century when federal troops were sent here to battle union organizers have so many government agents moved so heavily against one community in the region. People thought that there must have been a movie being filmed when all the agents swarmed into town. They had these, FBI jackets on, they had guns, they were just, they showed up like in this big drove, like a huge wave of simultaneous busting down doors. Larry LaRocco is quoted in this article saying, "I wonder if they are using an F-117 when a small rifle would do the job." And then he also adds, "The Silver Valley has long had a live and let live attitude and a colorful way of life that local officials have tolerated." Dick Karen, he's pictured, he's on the left in that photo. He says, "We might be hicks from the sticks, but we know what overkill is." That basically became the mantra, I guess, about the raid, was that it was overkill. Was this really necessary? We're just little Silver Valley. We don't, how is this appropriate? This is not an appropriate response, was kind of the feeling. There was a lot of minimizing of, the harm of gambling. I mean, there is, of course, some harm that comes with gambling, right? But the idea is that, the people were choosing to do this. There was the thought that also we needed to have gambling as a part of our economy, because during this time, even though the rest of the country was somewhat thriving, through the 80s, Bunker Hill had shut down in 1981. Lots of other mines had followed suit. The big corporations had moved their mine offices out of town, and then all of a sudden, like, we had huge surge in unemployment. We had a huge population drop, and the economy of the valley essentially plummeted. So Eisman, Sienkiewicz's lawyer, he argued that it's a different world there, and he's here. I quoted him, basically saying, here's what I said, to the feds. He said, what you really ought to do is get up there and get to know these folks, get to know why they do what they do, get to know the history of the community, get to know why they have to have poker machines in their bars to survive. He was basically saying, like, go talk to the people in the valley and find out some more, learn about the culture, try to understand the history, and you'll see, like, maybe this isn't something that we need to be, like, prioritizing at the federal government level at this moment.
Who was Sienkiewicz's?
Oh, he was the sheriff at the time. Sorry, did I miss that fact? So Frank Sienkiewicz's was the sheriff who they who the federal government was targeting. So this guy, Frank Wayne Maness was his name. He was the FBI agent who was kind of like in charge of the raid, and he really just like had it out for Frank Sienkiewicz's, for the sheriff. There were supposedly some disgruntled deputies in Wallace that had decided that they didn't like the way that the sheriff was running things, and so they came over here to Coeur d'Alene, talked to this Wayne Maness FBI agent, who he says in his own book that he was bored and he was looking for something to do. And so that was how this whole thing kind of got started. There was supposedly some connection with this Charlie Burns character who lived up Terror Gulch. They thought that he was like running some, drug ring out of there, and that the sheriff was overlooking it. There was a murder that had happened. And so this was all enough to like pique Wayne Maness's interest and get his sights set on Frank Sienkiewicz's. And once he did, he was like obsessed, like weirdly obsessed, in my opinion. Like it became personal, I think, for him to try and bring Frank Sienkiewicz's, the sheriff, down. And so, but the offices in Boise and in Seattle, the FBI offices there, they didn't really want to touch it. They weren't interested in it. So he had to go all the way to Salt Lake City to find someone who was interested. So once again, this system that had been established was a matter of like somewhat public record. These so-called payoffs were volunteered by bar owners and madams, and they went right into an account that was kept by the Chamber of Commerce. As you can see, this is a federal prosecutorial report by the FBI. They were interviewing here Darlene Murphy. That was Ginger, who ran the Oasis rooms. And as you can see, she was talking about, like, we sent the money to the Chamber of Commerce. We didn't want it to appear like a payoff because we just wanted to, assist the city. Basically, she was saying that she, was trying to assuage her guilty conscience. That was kind of a theme too that sort of came up with a lot of these madams. They were wanting to compensate for the perceived harm that they may have been doing. But they also knew that it was very good public relations for them to support the city. And then many people say that the madams did this out of the goodness of their heart as well, that they wanted to, give back to the community. So Hollis Anderson was the lawyer who represented Ginger and also Merrill Field, who was he was one of the video poker machine owners. And she told me, she goes, they didn't lie, they just didn't cooperate. So there's a part in Ginger's interview where it says, Murphy advised that she had told the FBI the truth, only that she had not told them everything. So it was like, she told them the truth, but not the whole truth, until they then came back and like read this information that they'd found from another source. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the FBI had to run out of Salt Lake City because Spokane, Seattle, Boise didn't believe that an extended undercover investigation was warranted. They spent 2.5 years, and maybe even a little bit more, doing this investigation. So one of the two undercover officers didn't believe that what they were actually doing was justified, but he went along with it because he was a man of integrity. He was this Medal of Honor recipient. He had one eye. He was apparently a very good human, but he didn't believe in it, but he still did it anyway. But this is an undercover officer who is like basically saying like there's nothing here, but you could not convince the FBI agent Manus of that. So the sheriff was charged with violating the RICO Act. So that's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act that they charged organized crime and mobsters with. Attorney Dan Butler and Nancy Newsom were prosecutors. They were coming from the well-funded Office of Public Integrity, and they bragged that they had never lost a case like this. And my argument is that it was overkill. It was not really about gambling, even supposedly it was, right? It was not really about corruption or prostitution or drugs, even though these were the explicit reasons. These were the reasons that the FBI gave for coming to raid. But they could have, like sorted that out had they just like had some conversations with the public officials, but they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? What do you all think?
Control.
Yeah, there you go. That's the word. So yeah, and I think you look back on it, and this is really the theme that has kind of emerged throughout all of the federal interventions through the years, right? It's about control. So ultimately, Sheriff Sinkovich was not convicted. His defense successfully argued that he was a scapegoat, that there was 100 years of tradition established. His first trial ended in a hung jury, so it was a mistrial. There was a woman from Orfino who was on the jury, and she just refused to convict, right? Because Orfino is one of those other last American West towns, if you know anything about Orfino. And so Mr. Eisman, he told me, he's like, I knew that she was going to be a holdout. He fought to like keep her on the jury. He figured if he could maybe just get through to her that he could hang the jury, because he thought that she would probably agree with the cultural values. And then, so she did. She refused to convict and hung the jury. And then the second trial resulted in an acquittal. So what Eisman said is, what this case is really about, and I wrote on the board, Frank's a scapegoat. And it stayed there on the board during the whole argument. And a couple of jurors after the trial said, that guy was nothing but a scapegoat. So he was like basically like, yeah, that worked. If you can put just like one key word up there that they can like latch on to, give them a reason to help with their argument. The whole episode was ultimately kind of an embarrassment for the FBI. It was a blip on their radar, though. This wasn't like a huge lasting deal for the FBI. Of course, Ruby Ridge and Waco kind of like came afterwards and overshadowed what happened in Shoshone County. But it was a really big deal for us in Shoshone County, whose bar owners relied on that gambling revenue. And you could also argue that like the tide was turning, right? It wasn't as though AIDS was happening, prostitution was kind of already on its way out in Shoshone County. The political tide was turning on gambling to where Idaho Lottery was starting up and Worley was starting their casino. And so there might have been some of these other political reasons to motivate what happened there as well. But this was an important turning point in the Silver Valley's history. This was basically the moment when we had to shift our thinking and be like, well, what are we gonna do now? Mining is kind of on the decline. I mean, we still have 2 mines open, but it's it's very small compared to what it used to be. And we don't have gambling to rely on. We don't have the brothels bringing in customers anymore. So what are we gonna do? And that was really when Shoshone County kind of started turning toward recreation and tourism as a way of life. So this was a huge turning point. The freeway started going over town. The last red light literally faded away at that point. And then you also had, what was it? The depot was being moved. It was like everything changed. Just really all at once here, it seemed. So this is my final slide. So this is a picture of Wallace in 1929 from the Barnard Stockbridge collection. So my argument, I guess, to kind of summarize, is that in each of these incidents, we see federal overreach, we see overreaction due to mostly attempts to control Shoshone County, which has historically wanted to go its own way, to follow the rules, but not necessarily the law. The raids of 1929 and 1991 were the result of these mining camp values that we first see emerge during the violent labor wars of 1892 and 1899. These were some of the most violent labor wars battles in the whole country. And of course, so that meant that people in Shoshone County felt justified in continuing with the gambling and the prostitution because they had been these cultural mainstays for 120 years. And part of that justification, too, was that our tax revenues built the state. So Shoshone County was contributing 5-to-1 on tax revenues for the ratio of what they were giving to what they were getting in terms of state tax revenue. But then, of course, you see once the economy kind of starts going down, which is another theme here in each of them, you got the economic recession in the 1890s, you've got the stock market crash in 1929, and then you've also got the Shoshone County's economic recession in 91. So the minute that the money influence fades away, then you see the feds kind of stepping in and trying to reestablish themselves. And then finally, we see our community taking care of itself, suspicious of outsiders due to this pattern of rights violations. And we see these attempts to govern ourselves according to our historic traditions. And I think that those values that I outlined at the beginning are really important for us to kind of preserve and maintain as we move into the future, because if we don't remember what these important values are and why they were established and where they came from, then of course, we lose something important that's a part of what makes the people in the valley the way they are, what makes our community unique and precious. So, thank you.